Please welcome the president of Montana Trappers Association, Matt Lumley.
Well, good morning, Denver. So let me tell you a story. My family and I, we live about 20 miles north of Yellowstone National Park, and we live the average life just like all of you. So in October 2021, I just picked up my boys from football practice, and we got home that night, and 20 yards behind my house, we got the chicken coop and the dog kennel, and my wife, Nikki, has her greenhouse. And we noticed all the poultry was running around the yard. I looked at my youngest son, Bridger, and he's 12, and I said, "Did you leave the door open this morning?" He says, "No, Dad." So we go out, and it just snowed about 4 to 5 inches that morning. And sure enough, there's a hole through the side of the coop, and small hole. We started circling out and around, and we find a coyote track, and then the breastplate of their prize turkey that they'd been raising for about a year. So I told Bridger he's obviously very upset. This is his prize turkey. That night at 11:30, my wife hollers from the bedroom, "Matt, the dog's just barked." So I fire up the gun, and it's snowing sideways, pitch black. And I go out around the front of the house, and there's a fresh turkey track, so I know the animals are out, so something's in the coop. I'm going out to shoot a coyote. And I go out around the hot tub, and I'm climbing a hill there in the dark. Come around the corner there at 10 feet is a 7-year-old, 500-pound grizzly bear. I truly hope that nobody in this room ever has to experience this because they're pretty big up close. And I don't remember flipping off the safety. I do not remember depressing the trigger. But what I will tell you is the first round went into his chest at 8 feet. Now, for those of you that don't know, I've just violated the Endangered Species Act. You're better off to shoot a person. It's a crime scene at that point. 6 rounds later, the bear is down. Because once you shot the first time, I live in a little kind of subdivision, 20 acres. My neighbor to the north is very elderly, and my neighbor to the south, their son's got some handicaps. And the last thing you want in a division like that is a wounded grizzly bear in the dark, in a snowstorm. So the bear's dispatched, and I'm kind of like, well, that was interesting. Get in, and I call law enforcement. And the next morning, I've got 6 feds and state law enforcement agency people at my house. So why is this important? You know, God was with me that night. The next day, I was leaving on a pack trip to Wyoming, our annual pack trip. When we draw tags, we go to Wyoming for a week. My brother and them come out from the Midwest, and we go hunting. The next night, that would have been my 12-year-old son out there in the dark. 6 months later, there was a gentleman horn hunting behind our house, about 3 miles, and he was killed by a grizzly bear. I got extremely lucky that night. So I'd like to talk to you about what's needed. Where does this go? Because this is playing out time and time again in the West. The Rocky Mountain Front, Wyoming. So I was a federal trapper in Wyoming when I met my wife. Did a lot of grizzly bear work and things. You know, the Endangered Species Act is 50 years old. It's time for a facelift. We need a clear, concise method of delisting, not subject to judicial review. Time and time again with the ESA, wolves, prime example. We're in Colorado, so wolves are a hot topic here. I hear you guys decided you're going to bring them in. I would like to go on record and say that is a very bad plan. I'll go into that later. Clear, concise method of delisting, not subject to judicial review. Second, they need to get rid of international boundaries. You can go to Alaska tomorrow, buy a grizzly bear tag over the counter, and go grizzly bear hunting. And for the record, if any of you have been to Alaska, when you see a grizzly bear, he's headed the other way because they're hunted. This institutional knowledge, when you hunt an animal, when you manage a species, the bears that are raiding cabins, that are in raiding coops, they die. And the ones that are good, they're out and they're doing their thing. None of us would shoot the last of anything You know, black-footed ferrets are endangered. Panda bears are endangered. There's 60,000 wolves worldwide. That is not an endangered species in any way, shape, or form. We also need to redefine the definition of take. So right now, let's take sage grouse, for instance. If the sage grouse is listed, it will affect millions of acres across the 13 western states. That affects ranchers, farmers, mining, timber, any form of consumptive use, hunting, fishing, trapping. Because right now, currently, under the definition of take, if you're driving down a 2-track road with your family and the sage grouse is listed as endangered, and that sage grouse flies off, you've just taken that animal. And that use can be shut down. Roadless Act, different things. So we need to go to Congress, and we need a clear, concise method of delisting, not subject to review. Common sense Endangered Species Act reform, because currently they can sue, or a federal judge can provide an injunction. You know, isn't it interesting that every time we get wolves or something delisted, some judge in San Francisco weighs in on this, and he's probably never been out of his office or seen a grizzly bear? So let's go into the wolf reintroduction in Colorado, because I still have 4 minutes left. So you've had wolves since 2004. I was a Fed in Wyoming, and I was an aerial gunner and then a ground crewed over the Red Desert. And we would see those lone wolf tracks going out across the Red Desert into Colorado. And they know this. In the late 90s, in Gardner, Montana, there was late season cow and bull hunts. They harvested over 2,000 elk in 1997 in the late cow hunt. Do you know how many elk are harvested today in the late hunt in Gardner, Montana? None. That herd was 20,000 strong in 2001. It's under 5,000 today. Here's a question for you. Jackson Hole, Wyoming, Shiras moose. And the Shiras moose is an interesting thing because they only live in a very small geographic area. In 2001, 100 Shiras bull moose tags were issued around Jackson Hole, Wyoming. You know how many bull moose tags they give in Jackson Hole, Wyoming today? None. They're dead. Nobody's talking about this. My question to these folks is, you know, when you bring in wolves to Colorado, because you guys are sitting on the North American model of wildlife management should be celebrated as the greatest success story. Grizzly bear recovery should be celebrated as the greatest success story. But it's not. Kind of lost my train of thought here. Wolves. I love to chase them. It's a bad plan. I would recommend, if you want to do your own research, because there's lots of spin on it, but I went to the wolf delisting meeting in 2011 out in Washington, D.C., and I met a man by the name of Will Graves. Will Graves spent 26 years in the U.S. State Department in Russia, and he wrote a book called Wolves in Russia. If you want an interesting but dry read, read that book. It documents almost 4,000 people killed in Russia in the last 2 centuries. Ted Lyons and Will Graves wrote a book called The Real Wolf. The facts and the actual science surrounding these species is just fascinating. They carry hydatid cysts. Anybody familiar with hydatid cysts? It's a tapeworm. And it gets into your ungulates and it builds these cysts in the lungs. My son Bridger shot his first elk. We cut it open. And his lungs are full of cysts this big. It's transferable to humans, by the way. There are documented cases in Idaho, almost inoperable. Major human safety concern. So I'll close with that. I would like to thank you all for being here, and God bless.